Just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any, we did have you muted and the camera's off. So if you do have any questions or comments, you could put it in chat. If we do have time at the end, we'll open up the mics and people can ask their question. And other than that, I think that's it. So I just wanted to say with this next presentation, it's been near and dear to my heart because for the last 30 years of being at the commission, I had originally been assigned to help with starting an electronic records program, or back then we called it machine readable. And not much has changed since then. We still worry about obsolescence, especially file formats, and we worry about decay of media, that something's going to happen. So especially in the next 50, 100 years, which some records have that much retention, we wonder what's going to happen with the mind maps that we have digitized, with documents on waste management, because where was that disposed of, and when? We won't have it if there's something that happens with electronics. Same with our birth certificates that are now electronic. So this information is critical to avert environmental rights assistance. One of the things that we're doing at the state archives now is we're working on a digital record center. So this is a place that agencies can store inactive records, and we will provide preservation tools to help keep it for the 50, 100 years that it's necessary to keep. Something that, you know, if you have it in a Microsoft or something, you probably wouldn't even think about preservation. So I'm excited to introduce our new two new speakers. First, we have Dara Baker. She's the Chief of Library Services Unit at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. She's had an extensive federal career that worked with the Federal Judicial Center, the Export-Import Bank of the United States, the U.S. Naval War Academy, and the National Archives. She's a certified archivist. She also holds a master's degree of library science from the University of Maryland and an MA in history from Harvard University. Ann Mason is a senior electronic records policy analyst in the Office of Chief Records Officer at the National Archives, and she joined NARA, as we call it, in 2016. She has 24 years of federal government archival and records management experience and has been involved with several disasters that impacted federal records, archives, and cultural resources. So I want to thank our speakers for being here. And as I mentioned, we'll have a little question and answer at the end.
And Cindy, I just wanted to throw in that we will be recording this session.
Yes, thank you.
All right, I'm hoping that everyone can hear me. I'm going to share my slides.
We can hear you and we can see your slides there.
Yep, beautiful. I'm not seeing Anne, so I'm presuming she's here somewhere.
Yep, I'm somewhere in buried in the people.
Hi everyone. I am Dara Baker, and Ann Mason is my co-presenter today. Where I tend to like really funky PowerPoint slides, so this one seemed to fit well with all the puzzle pieces that both work and kind of don't. So we are here to talk to you about digital resources. So, you know, Cindy gave an excellent intro. You know, I'm in this current role. Previously, most of my jobs had been in archival institutions. And Anne is still with National Archives, which is where we met. I did include one of my personal favorite record stories down here, which is a lost, found, and returned constitution for one of the Georgia tribes. I didn't know if Anne wanted to sort of highlight something quick.
Yeah, I actually thought of one. And first of all, let me apologize. The internet at home was being really wonky. I had to go into the office, and the setup here is not really very good for this kind of presentation. So unfortunately, it's hard for me to look directly at the camera. But anyway, so I responded to Superstorm Sandy at New York City and evacuated off like 1 million museum objects off of Ellis Island when the museum was impacted. And I was going through the storage, kind of trying to figure out what was there. And I see I don't remember exactly what the label said. It was something about Boaz. I'm like, Boaz, Franz Boas was here. And I opened it up, and sure enough, it was all of Franz Boas's records of, the x-rays and all the records of looking at the immigrants trying to disprove the scientific-based racism that was popular at the time. So that was kind of exciting for me. I'll turn it back over to Dara.
Yep. Well, and I also want to say, I'm sure that there are some people I've probably met over the years at a NARA conference or something else. So if I have met you, hello. And if I haven't, we're delighted to be here. So this presentation sort of is focused on a little bit the sort of all the things that could go wrong with electronic records if we don't do a good job thinking through and taking care of it. Wanted to start with a bit of the sort of state of the art and where we are now in terms of scale. I will tell you that when I started out in archives, my first experience as a researcher was still card catalog. A lot has changed in the last 25 years. So much so that when I talk to people coming out of the library school, they look at me, they're like, things were manageable through paper, really? All right. So this is a slide from a company online called Raconteur. I thought it was really, really helpful to sort of get some ideas of how much data you actually could create in a day. So in 2019, they were estimating that every day there would be 463 exabytes of data, which would be the equivalent of 212 million DVDs a day. On average, each person creates 2 gigs, but only 2% of that data is saved and retained. That is what we are here for. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between the born digital and versus digitized. Most of us may have worked with materials that we have been told we need to digitize the material. It's important to understand, and I had to teach this to myself, that once something is digitized, you kind of have to treat it the same way that you treat born digital. You have to do the same work in terms of understanding the file format, understanding the methodology, and then making sure that however you have digitized it, it will be able to move into the future. And more we feel pressure to not keep the physical originals, and that's something that each of you will have to determine at your institutions. So yeah, much bigger numbers than I think a lot of us expected. And did you want to do this one?
Sure. So the U.S. National Archives has been in the electronic records business for over half a century now, and we have I should see 900 terabytes and over 800 file formats, lots and lots of different formats, some of which we're not even sure what they are. Particularly the presidential records, we kind of intake everything and get a lot of just odd things with the presidential records. Yeah, I don't know if you want to talk about Library of Congress, Dara.
So Library of Congress currently, so important to know, so 900 terabytes, that is, oh, good Lord, I was never good at this type of math. It's like doing metrics from somebody who grew up in imperial system. But if you sort of take a look at these numbers, the UK Web Archive, which is specifically web content that the UK harvests, that is basically UK government websites. Alone, they have 379 terabytes just of web content and 8.2 billion web content objects, 5.7 million social media. And this is something that they just started probably about 5 to 10 years ago. Library of Congress, obviously down the street from those of us at the National Archives, they have 21 petabytes and 914 million unique files. And that single Twitter archive, which you may have heard about, that they collected between 2006 and 2010, that alone has 133 terabytes. So that's what, 1/8 of everything that is in the National Archives ERA system right now. So thinking about that 2%, that 2% is still a massive amount of electronic records. I also wanted to sort of introduce some terms here. I have a feeling, and feel free to, raise your hand if you've heard of these. So megabytes, gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes. The next one that comes after a petabyte is an exabyte. And apparently we have entered the world of zettabyte. I don't think we've created a name for what comes next. If you know that name, feel free to put it in the chat. And so this is really the scale on the exponential level of how we have to talk about the amount of storage and the amount of information that is currently out there. And the National Archives has put out a digital preservation framework. Thank you, Matthew. And the Library of Congress actually has their recommended formats. And in these, they've identified 800 different file format types. And those are the ones that we know about. If you think about something like PDF, it's not only PDF that we know and PDF-A that you may know from the PDF archival, but there are multiple versions of PDF. So 1.0, 1.1, all the way up through 1.7. And I think we're now on 2.0. So all of that changes and all of that needs to be kept because you don't know what format something's going to be in when you get it. All right, so Anne and I have divided this up into sort of 6, we're calling them vignettes. They're sort of experiences that we've had or things that have happened to records or could happen to records that show you the bad, the ugly, and the possible. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we will take, if we have them, we'll try to answer them between each of the vignettes. This is not an exhaustive list of things that could possibly happen to records, but they are things that we thought were important to highlight.
Yes, I have the first vignette, which is, of course, cyber attacks and hacking. Just to give you a sense of scale of the problem, in 2023, U.S. federal agencies reported over 32,000 cybersecurity incidents, and worldwide, there is 1.9 million ransomware attacks every day. So this particular situation, an organization had an on-premise data center that was hacked. The entire data center was taken offline for quite a while. One of the servers had permanent records that was thought to be the source of intrusion for the cyber attack that was deemed unrecoverable. There were permanent records on that server, and unfortunately the data center, the backups were very hit or miss, and the server was one of the miss, and we lost a lot of permanent records that were federal publications. And yeah, it was kind of sad. So I would say part of the problem, I should go to the next slide, please, Dara. So part of the problem with this particular organization, I think it starts at the top with the lack of recognition by management that jobs can require specific expertise. You know, we can't be jack of all trades necessarily. So there was definitely, you know, just, it can't be that hard to run a data center, you know, we can do it. And the IT staff was pretty small. It was really 2 key people. And so you could, you know, as you can imagine, if one of them retired or went on extended leave or something, they would be in trouble. As I said before, there's not redundancies in the data. There's not redundancies in the personnel or knowledge within the institution. So they did, I think, learn something from this whole incident where they moved into the cloud with a vendor. They're in a much better position now to not have this happen again. They have, you know, vendors who have the expertise. The data centers are spread out over the country, so it's much less of a problem, or much less of a chance of this happening now compared to when this happened. And next slide.
Oh, the famous words, right? Ever since this movie came out, we all use this one. So I get to present on, I think, one of the first incidents that I learned about that really drove home how difficult it is to think about the future when you're in the present. So this is a hardware breakdown story. I have a feeling that most people who are here have probably had this experience. In this specific example, the Apollo 13 quote is applicable on a number of levels. So here's the situation. You have content, but you can't read it. In this case, it was the audio and video transmissions for the 1960s space missions. The Apollo 1, 11, 13, and Gemini 8 audios, and the Apollo 11 video or film, depending on sort of, I guess, sort of video and film are incredibly different, but in this case, it was film. So in this case, part of the issue was that when the decision was made to get these transmissions from the moon, there were concerns about how they were going to be able to travel, and they had to package them and film them in incredibly slow audio and video. And the machines that read and understood these records had not been maintained. I think the story here is that for the video and film, there was literally one machine that could read it that was actually at the Goddard Space Center. For the audio tapes, which were located at the National Archives, they could only be played on one type of machine called a soundscriber. They had two machines, but one of the machines it was a vacuum tube machine, so they'd taken the tubes for the one, so they literally had one machine that could play it. And in this case, it wasn't just a hardware failure, it was potentially multiple points of failure because no one who currently worked at NASA or NARA knew how to work the soundscriber machine. So they had to bring a technician back in out of retirement to refurbish the machine. And so if you think about, how can you not be able to read this incredibly important information, this is where all of our expectations and all of our sort of understanding of how do we determine importance comes from. So here, I think it was very much a case of everybody presumed that everybody knew that it was important, and so it must have been preserved, it must have been taken care of. And instead, you ended up in this situation where you presumed that there was interoperability, that the different types of film, the different types of audio would be able to be played on different types of machines, that any labeling that you had, so the Apollo 11 tapes in particular, the film was problematic because there's a report that came out from NASA. If you read the report, a lot of it is near successes where they think that they found what they're looking for, but they are not described correctly, or they're not where they're supposed to be, or you can't find the labels, or the label that meant something to somebody a long time ago doesn't mean anything to anybody now. And we all working under the presumption that equipment will last or technology won't change that quickly. For those of us who've been working in archives or in cultural heritage for at least the last 15 years, you probably remember your gold CDs being sold to us, saying that they will last forever and you will be able to play them forever. And I can't remember the last time I saw a CD player on purpose, let alone by accident. And, the core here is, and this happens with storage quite a lot as well. So someone in a business is going to tell you what you need to hear in order for you to understand the business and to go along with the business. But it is our responsibility to ask those questions for continuity of operations and for exit from the system. Don't just believe what the vendors tell you. See what we can find out to make sure that we will understand how it goes. Now, on the best practices side, I think that there are some really important lessons here, particularly from this circumstance. So number one, if you can, make multiple copies of everything and put them in places, and don't put them in the place that you think you're going to remember where you put it, because that's where I lose things all the time. But it really is an emphasis on documentation practices. Clearly identify your resources, reassess these regularly. If you have new staff members coming in, I strongly suggest having them take a look at your documentation to see if it makes sense to somebody who hasn't worked at your institution for a long time. So always write as if you're writing for somebody who knows nothing, or as little as possible. Document your decision-making about records retention, format policies, system migrations. I also leave notes for myself based on my previous experience about why I didn't choose something. So I have personal abbreviation, which is NOU, nothing of use, which has been transformed into a we did not go with the system because. And it's going to seem like it takes a lot of time. It's going to seem like it takes a lot of effort, but it is going to save so much down the road. And then this last one is something that you should all be familiar with, which is doing our best to protect institutional knowledge under the documentation practices. And then, lots of copies keep stuff safe, and the digital version of that. And then in terms of actions that you can take at an institution to try to institutionalize or implement some of these, have a format migration policy, have something shared, among everyone who works where you are, even if it's just you, so when you come back to it in a year or two, because I started out my career as a pure on lone arranger. So yeah, even some of my own decisions I don't remember. See if you can determine preferred formats, see if you can retain the original and keep a preferred copy, and then where possible, develop a sustainability or digital preservation strategy.
All right, the next one is hidden data, hidden poison pills. Yeah, so hiding data in files is it can be really difficult to detect them, and there really are not good tools to detect to detect the data. If you go to the next slide, please, Dara. So this happened to NARA, where we had a PowerPoint file that we received from Department of Defense. We promptly put it up on our website since it was born digital, easy enough to do. Unfortunately, there was a hidden file attached to that PowerPoint that had the social security numbers and other sensitive HR data of the DoD personnel. We took it down, obviously, as soon as we heard, as soon as we realized that, but the damage was already done. The data was out there. Maybe it's living on the dark web somewhere, who knows. To the right, I just took a quick screenshot of the Microsoft help that talks about how to find hidden cells in an Excel spreadsheet. As you can see, it's not something that you would really necessarily go to as part of your regular, doing business and using an Excel spreadsheet. And some other things like PDFs can have a lot of things hidden in them. That's another one. And even if there's not hidden files, like I know NARA has we've long wanted to have a PDF specification to basically have a declaration of what are the contents, so we know what's supposed to be in the file. And then also we'll know when something is missing from the file. NARA made quite a, we brought this up over and over and over again at ISO. I sit on the technical committee. It's the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO. They have a technical committee that writes specifications for file formats, and ISO has specifications for like pretty much anything you can think of. So I sit on that committee, and NARA has, for quite a long time had this drum of we need to know what is in the file, and PDF declaration has now become a thing that exists. It's still optional and in the process of becoming part of the PDF standard, but I'm very hopeful that the PDF declaration will be very useful for us knowing what is in the file and hopefully being able to find some of this sensitive data and not expose more data. All right, next slide, please, Dara. So there's often a thing of, oh, if this is really a problem, there'll be a tool. Well, maybe, maybe not. Sometimes it happens. But they're also, depending on the commercial sector, often to create these tools, there has to be a profit motive for them to do it. PDF Association that shares the ISO, standard on PDF, they are nonprofit, so they kind of don't necessarily have so much of that profit motive, but not, a lot of companies are not nonprofits. And to say, unfortunately, there's no single tool that can check all file formats. It's kind of hit or miss as to whether there's a tool for the different formats, and it can be really hard to find. I mean, like I said, NARA archivists are, we know our stuff, and we didn't see this hidden spreadsheet. So, and then if it's known to you, like, there are certain files that are more prone to have hidden data. PDFs and Office documents are one that comes to mind, where it's fairly easy for you to hide data and hide cells. And like I said, if you were not the creator of the record, and in NARA, as many times we're getting records from other federal agencies, and a lot of archives are in that position where they did not create the record, they are the receiver of the record. And so if you don't know the data is there, you don't necessarily know to look for it. And we'll go to the next slide, Dara. And so technological obsolescence, or the Vanishing Act. You all maybe remember, if you were a web designer or involved in animation, you used Adobe Flash, right? So Adobe Flash had, at one point, had a very large user base, many web games, animations, graphic interfaces. It was embedded in lots and lots of web pages. When Flash shut down, I was a web manager and was furiously trying to recode the websites to get rid of Flash so that hopefully they would continue working. In this case, Adobe did give us some notice that it was happening, so you could at least kind of plan ahead. But a lot of times this can happen without notice. And in fact, earlier this year, Synapse is a company that provides banking services, and it's kind of the middleman between the consumer and the banks. And from what I gather reading about it, they provided that banking service for a lot of online banks and kind of small startup banks, and cryptocurrency, that kind of thing. They very abruptly went bankrupt in May, I believe it was, this year. And there are approximately 10 million account holders whose money was frozen when that happened. They could not get the money out. Even if the banks wanted to give it to their customers, there was no way to get it to them because the mechanism that Synapse provided was gone. And next slide, please, Dara. So yeah, best practices: beware of technological obsolescence. It can happen quickly and sometimes without any notice. And it's not just software or a service, but also hardware. Remember a couple of years ago when Apple changed the plug on their phone, and it caused kind of a big stir. Some folks were pretty angry. They all had to replace their cords. It can happen hardware, software, services. Service providers can just go bankrupt and no longer provide their service. Kind of the idea of like, well, if we leave it to the future, somebody will figure out, if we have a website that runs Flash, somebody will figure out how to make it work again. Doesn't always happen. Emulation is something that, I think the last few years I've heard more and more about, but it's very expensive. It's very labor intensive. And for some place like the National Archives, where, just trying to scale up for very large collections, something like an emulation is really not possible. And just with all the different formats we'd have to create a bunch of different emulations. So it's really not a viable preservation strategy, I think. And all right, so pass it back to Dara.
I have a feeling a few of us have seen this very, very unfortunate screen, or a version of it. Basically, what happens when you can't get access? And this happens in a couple of different, so this is not a specific case, unlike our other examples here. This is more of a general. So imagine your office is given a laptop or a zip file or an external hard drive from, in the case of National Archives, or in the case of some of the places that I've worked, a closed commission, a closed office, a retiring or departing official, and it's handed over to the records division, and either the machine doesn't turn on or none of the files will open. In this case, if you can get it to work, the files are all in proprietary formats, and you don't have the software any longer if you ever had it at all. And this tends to happen most often, in my experience, with architectural, so things like CAD files, or any other type of art-related or architecture-related system, and rapidly changing formats like social media. But it can also happen to text-based files, including word processing, So, most of us know that when we go into Word, if you have an older Word file, you may have something that says, this is a 97, from 97 to 2003. Do you want to save it in the updated format file? So think about what happens when Word doesn't have that available. Or think if you are trying to open something from somebody who was working in the 90s and they hand you a number of floppy drives. Number one, you have to be able to read the floppy drive. And number two, they may be in a file format like WordPerfect that is not available. All right, so looking again at sort of, if we choose to not do anything, very similar to the previous example, if we preserve it, someone will figure out how to open it. We might have tools that can open some of it, but not all of it. So this is the talk of the look and feel versus the actual function. And the example that I use a lot of the times is, there are quite a few institutions that have made the decision that they're going to do oh, come on, brain. Basically the disk image of whatever they receive. And there are some institutions that have chosen not to do disk images. And so if you are trying to find out something like what did President Obama's desktop computer look like, his icons, that's not something that we're going to be able to see because that's not the way in which the records are kept. And so we have to accept here that some content will be lost and we may not know what has been lost, rather than being able to make it as a appraisal decision, if a rational decision for what we decide to keep and what we decide not to keep. And this is where that digital dark age comes from. We may end up with whatever we are able to keep and whatever we were able to find, and not what we wanted to keep or what we wanted to be able to find. So best practices here are, identify any file formats as soon as possible, and preferably when materials are donated or received. I know some archives that are trying to get donors to provide them with this information, either from an office or from somewhere else, to at least be able to identify what the file extension is, or to be able to know in advance that they need to send it to somebody for digital forensics or send it to the IT department. And that's the second bullet point here, which is acquire tools or locate services that would allow staff to convert content to open formats. And this is what both Cindy and Anne said at the beginning is, this may not be you being able to do it on your own. This may be contacting somebody else at one of the other institutions that is here who may have that expertise, or to try to look into, just the same way that you would if there was a mold outbreak or a flood, are there some vendors that you can take a look at to see if you could have them on standby if needed. Establishing formats as a preference or a standard where possible. National Archives and almost all archives have this issue where we do have preferred formats, but you may not be able to control what you get in. And then the last one is to acquire some file format validation tools. There are some out there, some are more open source. These are not, plug and play. These are not things that you can just figure out how to do on your own. But if it is something that you're interested in and it is something that you think that would be helpful, there are courses and tools, and we'll have some of that information toward the end of the presentation. All right, and then the last example that we have, which is partly my personal favorite, I probably should have also had like spaghetti stick into the wall here, because that's also an excellent analogy. File formats everywhere. Yes.
Yeah.
We've
Before
got
we
a
move on
couple
to the
questions.
next, yeah, we got a couple questions in the chat.
All right.
So Laura was asking, is there a requirement to go digital? For the federal government, yes, there is. It kind of depends, I suppose, on where you work, whether there's a requirement or not. The Federal Records Act was amended in 2014 with directions for the National Archives to create regulations for digitization with an eye to destruction of the original source records. And then also going forward to moving to digital government. There's been digital government initiative. And in fact, actually June of this year, NARA stopped accepting or we can announce that we will no longer accept analog records unless you have a particular exception, and that exception is usually only going to be granted if there's some kind of intrinsic value to the analog format that it's in. So for federal government, yes, we're all in. In fact, that's part of what I do, is write a lot of the regulations and policies and guidance to help federal agencies implement that. But I don't know what Pennsylvania.
Yeah, it's not in the state agencies nor the local governments have that mandate. We do have a PDFA policy that if they want to keep permanent records electronically, they can have it in PDFA, but we don't have a mandate that they must be electronic.
And as far as the second part of that question, is there a requirement if we do go digital to retain the original copy? From what I understand, and obviously my experience is also on the federal side, agencies are being told to send their permanent records to the National Archives as electronic records. It is up to them how they get there and what they do with the paper or whatever the analog is going to be, whether or not that's, film reels or something else. The requirement to retain or to discard an original, it may be dependent on where your institution is. I know that there is some pressure from some places to, if you're going to digitize, then you should not keep the paper. I will say that my personal opinion here is that while our digitization and our scanning is better, our appraisal and ability to understand everything that we have in our electronic systems is not quite there yet. I would also say one of the things that we are getting away from is the case where, I worked at an institution where I had to take in a 700 box collection from somebody, and 300 of those boxes were the printed out emails. Because back in the day, email management included printing out all of the emails that you received. So I would prefer not to receive 300 boxes of printed out emails, including spam emails. Let's see. Julia had a comment, which is, very true, both that Mac and PC have different file systems and that the file systems can be an issue and not just individual files or whole devices. Some file systems can't be read by certain computers, or in certain circumstances, also if you have hidden files or if you have too many layers of folders, that can cause an issue for some of the file transformation and file transfer type tools. It's also, and we didn't mention it here, if your file naming conventions are not helpful and everything ends in a jumble and you have 8 folders labeled Dara Baker 1, I'm not sure how you're supposed to figure out what everything is. Let's see.
I can take Catherine's question if you want about what are the best practices for dealing with email.
Sure.
Yeah, so NARA actually has some guidance on our website. I'll put a link in the chat. We have a bulletin. NARA has bulletins that give federal agencies guidance. And we have a bulletin that talked about file formats. These are formats that NARA believes we can preserve long term. So there's a lot of information there about email. So some of the ones that we have decided are preferred formats are like inbox and internet message format, or EML. And in that case, it kind of depends on how you want to do it. Some of these formats, you can do individual messages. I think we would prefer to have those conversation threads and have like someone's mailbox as more of a whole. And that's kind of how Capstone, if you've heard of that, that's kind of how Capstone is set up, where the senior officials at the agencies, the entire mailbox is preserved, or the entire account is preserved. And that's what NARA would get, rather than single emails. Let's see.
Can you, I don't know if I'm completely sure what your letter books look like, because there can be different from institution to institution. So how do you replicate them for the digital version so that it's accessible? If you're talking about sort of like lots of letters sort of in a book, and so you can flip through them, versus doing a digitized version. I think that's still an ongoing conversation about how to make the digitized content flippable rather than each individual file and having to open each individual file. And I think that some of that is us asking for that from vendors and hoping that somebody creative will do something. But in this case, the sort of same information, like the header information that you would see in an email in terms of the to, the from, the date, any content that you can get is always helpful. All right, so Miriam has a question. So if digitized and the record has evidential but not necessarily artifactual value, can the original go away? I'm going to use the good old archival, it depends. One of the examples that I like to tell, which is a little bit of an edge case, is there was a collection of material that was supposedly from the Civil War. It was, basically Civil War letters back and forth. If you had just digitized them and had not looked into the quality of the paper, we may have believed, and this is apocryphal story. I don't heard like through conferences and stuff. I don't actually have a specific example. But it was supposedly written on really good quality, high quality paper from like Georgia in 1864. And so if any of you are familiar with the Civil War, Georgia in 1864, the chances of having really good high quality paper to write on were really slim. So the validity of those could come into question if you don't have enough information on the medium that it comes from, the same way with a file format. And we'll talk about that a little bit here. So I'm going to cover this last one, and I think we'll come back to this set of questions again. These are great questions. All right, so for file formats everywhere, this is similar to the previous one for the bricked. And here it's, when you're working with any type of electronic materials, working with digital content is exponentially more difficult if you can't identify the file format. And not all files have a recognizable file extension. So things that we know of like PDF, docx, CSV. Older files may not have any way to identify their format at all. And knowing the format is often the first step to determining preservation and access processes. So if you don't know what the format is and you take an action on a file or an action on a hard drive, you may end up doing damage in a way that you did not anticipate. And this goes to the last question. The file format may also be part of a discussion on authenticity. So if you have a famous author who may have been, or a congressperson who had been working on a computer in the 1980s, and somebody tells you that they have a Word file of theirs, they probably is not authentic. But it's also a conversation to have when you are determining your file migration or file transformation. Same way as that statement about documentation, to document those decisions so that you can trace back if anybody does have a question on authenticity. All right, so very similar. So, if we preserve it, someone will figure out how to open it. Some tools might get some of the content. Sure, that'll be fine. And the truth here is that ensuring access to the right programs is complex and hard for each individual organization to manage. On the best practices side, similar, identify any proprietary software, acquire any tools, establish the formats. And I think this is the positive side of an emulation community. And someone said that they had found some tools to be able to open old word processing that's out there. Join an emulation community if possible. There are ways to open things. When I got to my job with the Navy, I was told I couldn't use any USBs, but my CPU had a floppy disk drive, so I could do some basic digital forensics that way. All right. And so that is the sort of core of our vignettes here. We're going to move into sort of some more general information and some ways and things that we think could help both that either we've done or can help others as they step into this world. Anne, did you want to?
Yeah, I'll take the little first section there. So Again, ISO is the International Organization for Standardization. They have a TC, stands for Technical Committee. TC 46 is for Archives and Records Management. I am one of the US representatives to that committee. So if you want to know about ISO and the standards that we have, feel free to drop me an email, contact me. And you do not have to be from a national-based organization to participate. We have a number of universities and local archives that that represent the US as well. And there's also TC 171, I think I mentioned that earlier, talking about PDF. They're looking at file formats, and we've actually started looking at format types, like we're working on a reference model for textual documents. Kind of, what are the inherent characteristics of a textual document? It's actually been kind of a rough slog on that one. Fermi, which Cynthia just put in the chat. I love Fermi. I wish this was available when I was at Park Service doing records management and kind of floundering without much guidance. I think they have it is for federal agencies. That's the primary audience, but they do have like success criteria that I think would be applicable to pretty much any organization. So success criteria for electronic records. There also is a spreadsheet that has requirements for electronic document records management systems. And it's, the entire records management lifecycle with very detailed requirements. They're written in a way that you can kind of plug them into a scope of work for a contract. That's kind of the intent. And also the other brilliant thing with that spreadsheet is it has it traces back where did that requirement come from, and it will cite whether it's an ISO standard, a federal law, some other guidance product. They'll say where, you can know where that requirement comes from to know whether it's applicable to you or not. I mentioned the bulletin before about file formats. That's here. Again, these are formats that NARA considers preservation worthy. One of the factors in there is whether we as an institution have the expertise, tools, knowledge, et cetera, to preserve it. So your institution may have different ideas of what is preservable or not, but it's a good place to start. And then the metadata guidance, again, we call it the minimal metadata guidance that NARA needs in order to accurately manage the records or properly manage the records. Again, it's definitely minimal metadata. We do a lot more description when we accession the records, and without all of that description, I think researchers would have a very hard time finding records with just the minimal metadata in that bulletin. But again, it's a good place to start.
And I didn't put them here, but the two things that I mentioned on one of the previous slides in terms of the digital preservation framework that is available on the National Archives site, and also downloadable from GitHub for anybody who's interested. It has all of the file formats, all of the sort of information about the file formats, and the Library of Congress's recommended formats are also available in digital format. And I think that those are also great resources. In terms of trainings, one of the best that I've done, particularly for an entree into sort of the digital preservation world, is the Digital Preservation Coalition's Novice to Know-How. This has been incorporated in a number of trainings and is actually part of what the National Archives gives to people in terms of for anybody doing digital preservation work. And there's also a digital preservation handbook available through them. If you're not familiar with the DPC, they are located and originated in the UK. They do have a North American office now, and they really are focused on providing everything from super beginner to expertise. They also have excellent information on storage. So they have a storage assessment tool as well. And then a couple of other organizations some of you may be familiar with or not. So NARA, ARMA, and then NEDCC, which is the Northeast Document Conservation Center, also has a digital preservation assessment training. And then this is just a limited set. There are many other things out there, but these are the ones that both Anne and I are familiar with and would give a thumbs up to.
Yeah, these are definitely worth looking into.
Yeah. And then we wanted to do a little bit here to sort of, we've done a little bit of the scare tactic. We've done a little bit of the sort of like all the things that could possibly go wrong. But we also recognize that having this conversation with other people who are not in our profession, and sometimes even people within our profession, can be a little hard. Some of the things are a little esoteric. Some of the conversations are, exactly on that sort of leave it to the future side of the like, I don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the funds, we don't have the expertise, let's just wait and it'll be fine. Or if it won't be fine, I'll retire and it'll be somebody else's problem. And so really wanting to move on from just the general elevator speech to thinking in terms of value add for this type of work. And so for me, I started out my career at Export-Import Bank. My first boss was a business librarian, and it was invaluable for me because I got really comfortable with the business speak. And so a lot of the work that we do, we don't generate funds in general, but we are really about return on investment, and we are really about saving money for a larger organization. And so, thinking about having, for yourself, to give to your leadership, if you are the leadership, to give to the next level up, internal numbers about the ways that your organization saves money compared to the private sector. How much would it cost if I had to bring in somebody to do digital forensics? How much would it cost if I had to pay somebody to do my storage? One of the things in particular with the NARA, with the National Archives ending taking paper records is not everybody's going to digitize and send things off. So there are plenty of private sector businesses willing to step in, but they are not going to save money in the long term.
Yeah, and I'll talk about the next bullet there. So, well, first, before I talk with FEMA, I also want to mention, so when I worked at Park Service and talked about records management and the importance of records management, I was very passionate about it. But they're largely a land management agency. They do have cultural heritage sites that they manage, but even then it's yeah, when you talk records, like the eyes glaze over and like, well, why is this even important? And we kind of ran into the same thing. I used to do continuity of government or continuity of operations. We call it COOP. So FEMA has a series of directives that the federal executive agencies must follow. And I sat on the interagency working group for continuity, and we kind of provided a lot of the guidance and wrote the directives and all of that kind of stuff. And how many times sitting in a meeting or in a, we always did a like a seminar every year, and we'd sit there like, why is NARA here? Why do we care about records? This is COOP. Like, we're concerned with just making sure that like these, the national, mission, the really important national stuff happens. And so we kind of in this directive, in an attempt to kind of get that buy-in, changed it from records to data and information. We still do talk about records, but it's primarily data and information, and kind of couch it in those terms. Records are data and information. If you have that information, you can make strategic decisions, you can be informed, you can do data-driven decisions. If you know Mark Patrick, he works for the DoD, he's their agency records officer. He essentially did this at Department of Defense to kind of get the buy-in into records management. And he's a really dynamic speaker and has done a number of really wonderful presentations about records or data, and you should care about them. And it's quite a fantastic presentation. So Mark Patrick, yeah, he's out there. I know that's out there on the interweb somewhere. I've watched it. There's the recordings of him. And I'll pass it back to Dara.
And I think that's an excellent segue, because I think one of the things that as a profession, for those of us who are in archives, records management, libraries, cultural heritage, we have a lot of hidden work that we don't show. And, compare this to all the conversations with IT. I mean, I know a lot of archivists and a lot of records managers whose job are IT and are, they're implementing systems, they're doing system design, they're doing, continuity of operations, they're doing migrations, they're doing all of those things. And we just don't talk about them in a way that I think has the same type of impact. And so here for me, I would sort of spend some time emphasizing all of the tools and methods that are used for electronic records works, the digital forensics, the digital preservation and digital file format validation, talk about the fact that preservation and access is for the future, and it's for at scale on-demand delivery in the future. And those things require investment, they require time, but they also require expertise. And so I like to think about it in terms of, it's not a set it and forget it kind of thing, right? In general, analog materials will stay stable if there's no outside emergency. Apparently, you guys heard about bugs earlier. But digital assets are on a spectrum of decay, obsolescence, inaccessibility, and vulnerability all the time. And so electronic records work as part of a whole records management lifecycle and is an essential process to protect and preserve the public's records, which you all are doing. And the frustrating part is our jobs don't get easier; they just get more complex. And so, this is sort of the core of what we wanted to present today. We had some citations to some of the things that we took a look at, particularly trying to get some sense of where that data and the size scale of data. And then here we are at questions. Thank you so much for letting us sort of, present all of this to you, and feel free to ask. It doesn't have to be anything specific to this presentation. You are welcome to ask any questions, and if we are capable of answering, we will do so.
Give me 1 second here. I'll go ahead and open it up so that anybody with questions can unmute to ask. So just give me 1 second and I will make that change. Participants are now able to unmute if you have questions to ask.
I have a question. I wanted to ask, I'm in the middle of an in-house project to convert pneumatic tape. And it's been a real eye-opener, because I have to tell you, pneumatic tape is, so we're converting these in-house with a digital converter. It's saving us $30,000. And what I'm amazed is that with a digital converter, it's like using a spaceship to power a steam locomotive, because our pneumatic player is from about 1975. And it's a real workhorse, I will admit, but it is the biggest, clunkiest thing you've ever seen.
Yes, I remember pneumatic tapes. I had to reformat some myself.
I have to admit that the video quality is excellent, better than VHS in some ways. But
oh yeah,
the problem is that, I mean, it's commercial grade, but I found one player on campus, and believe me, they probably had a fleet of them at one point, but it's just ancient technology.
I have a who works for a audio video transformation company, and she basically said to me recently, if you have any of these formats in your collection, you need to work on getting them digitized in the next 5 years, or you may not be able to. Partly because of the machines, partly because of the decay for the material, and just the age of it, right? So, they haven't been protected. You don't have any vendors out there who are creating new pneumatics or new VHSs that you can just transfer over from one to another. And then the other issue with that digitization is if you have something that's on a separate audio and a separate video, so you have to make sure that they're lined up, but you may have to do them separately. And then also having the scale for storage. And I think that that's something that not enough people are taking into consideration when they tell us you can store all the things. That storage is not free anymore, if it ever was.
Yeah, and AV files can be massive.
Yes, they can, and especially, I mean, even the scaled down versions are 2 gigabytes a piece for an hour. What I find funny about pneumatics is that so unlike VHS or any semi-modern format, the pneumatics can actually take 2 different sizes of tapes, one for 30 minutes, one for an hour, and they are completely different media format. It's crazy. Thank you.
Sure. I want to take Julia's question in the chat. If you have a file that shows up as just a file in Windows, how do you figure out what type of file it is? Is that when you use file validation tools? Yeah, that's probably one of the things I would do is so it's a Droid and Jove, Pronom, which is a UK initiative. They have the, what is it called, Dara? It's like, it's not signature, it's the thing that
Oh, good
identifies
Lord.
the file format.
Yeah, so Pronoun basically gives you the layout, and I'm going to have to Google the right word as well because it'll come to me as soon as we hang up. But it's basically the sort of the file structure and the file information for anything that you're looking at. And so, yeah, go ahead. Signature. Is it signature? Something like that.
Something like that, yeah.
And I'm going to spell Siegfried wrong, but this is another one. So Droid, Jove, Siegfried. And so basically what they do is, where possible, they will either tell you what the file type, file extension is, or they will give you a best guess. Sometimes they also can't tell, particularly for older files, so things for the 60s and 70s. So.
Dara, I see Adam in the comments asked if you could talk a little bit more about pneumatics.
Yeah, so the recommendation was for most audio video that would have been considered analog, so everything up through VHS tape, so your pneumatics, your I have a pile of them at my desk, and I'm sort of in presentation mode and not gathered data mode. Your VHS tapes, your Betamax tapes, your sort of anything that would have been from like the 80s to early 90s. It was suggested to me that those should be put on to digitize within the next 3 to 5 years. And so some of the older film, so the 16 millimeter, the 8 millimeter, as long as you don't have any vinegar syndrome or any decay with those, there will be ways to do that, but it's more of these sort of like 1970s, 80s, early 1990s, like the mini tapes and sort of some of those other things should be digitized sooner rather than later. Or at least reviewed to determine if you want to spend the money to digitize them. I think one of the questions that I grapple with a lot in my work, in my current job, but also my previous jobs, is how do we know that what we're keeping is stuff that we're going to want to keep, and how do we make it accessible to people in the future, right? So this preservation side of it, this sort of, let's make sure we can keep it, let's make sure that we can make it accessible to our internal is one part of it. The other question is, how do we make it external to someone else once we have it? And so the example of the hidden records is a large part of it. So having some better tools to identify PII, potentially looking into some automation or some, I'm not a big person who likes to say that we have artificial intelligence, because AI is not really the AI I thought it was going to be from the movies. It's kind of like advanced machine learning, but some of the advanced tools to help us manage the amount of content, and then also that file naming convention thing, which is such a problem.
Does anybody else have questions? Either put them in the chat or...
I have one question that I'll ask. If an archives or an office has a lot of different kinds of electronic records, they might be in different formats, they may be different ages or whatever, but do you have any suggestions on how they should prioritize what to do first? Because there's lots of different things clearly that have to be done to make sure that the electronic records are kind of safe and viable, but where do you start?
I think there's different thoughts on that. There can be which one is most at risk, and then I put in the chat earlier, the GitHub that NARA had. We kind of did a risk analysis for different formats to determine what's high risk versus low risk for preservation. I kind of like to do like what I call the low-hanging fruit, get the easy win first. At least you kind of, what can we do now with the skills, the tools, the knowledge that we have right now on staff, kind of a thing. Get that easy win, start there, and then kind of figure out, okay, now where do we go?
I have a similar hybrid approach. So I like to take a look at, if I can, the types of things that I know that people have asked for in the past and will most likely ask for. Then it's a question of assessing, what do I think I could do in-house and what do I need to send out? And then it's also a storage question. So if I have, 8,000, Word files or 8,000 spreadsheets or 600 databases or a file format that I'm just not sure what to work with, I may spend some time and energy trying to determine how to handle the more complex formats, because unless it's been identified as unstable or obsolete, those PDFs, those Word documents, they'll probably be okay a little bit longer than like your Access databases. I have a story of going to IT to ask for somebody to help me, with my Access database. And it was supposedly someone trained in Microsoft. And I showed up in the office, I knocked on the door and I said, hey, I need help with an Access database. And they're like, what do you need help accessing? And I'm like, oh, geez. So the things that, the file formats or the types of records that are more complicated or are connected to those proprietary formats are the ones that I would probably take a look at first. The ones that are more stable, so at this point, probably Excel, Word, your PDFs, things that are sort of relatively straightforward, may not be as significant for that type of prioritization. But this is all personal experience. It also maybe you may have somebody on site who absolutely adores working with raw files from a Canon camera from 1999, and if they have that skill set, use it.
Yeah, so one of the things I used in emergency management, which I kind of apply to preservation too, is what's most important, what's most at risk, and kind of look at those as priorities. We definitely did that at Ellis Island. One of the first things we evacuated out were the oral histories because they were really important. The film, obviously film and audio and visual is really susceptible to mold and moisture. And for some of those, that was the only copy. They didn't have money to create a lot of backup copies for those oral histories. And so, yeah, we wanted to get those out and get them stabilized. So I kind of do the same thing with digital preservation. What's most at risk? What's really important.
And just like taking a look at Fermi, taking a look at the risk matrix that NARA has developed may be helpful, because always having a way to go back to point to what decision you made and why, and especially for something if it's on the bubble for risk, would be helpful. And it may help to talk to a couple of other people on this call who may have similar or have very different material to see if you can come up with a risk matrix or a risk rubric that would work. So I think you guys have had a long day. Cindy has both of our contact information. You are welcome to reach out at any time. And I'm just delighted to see so many people here and sort of connected. And yeah, I mean, and I don't know if it'll help or hurt, I was the person when I started library school back in 2009, I had classmates who had to show me how to open Notepad because, yeah, I liked paper.
Yeah, I think we all do. But it's like you said, we can't just have it and then forget it, because that doesn't work that way. Maybe with paper a little bit more, but not with digital. And so again, I wanted to say, especially for the state agencies, we are creating this digital record center since we have the expertise at the State Archives and Preservation and know how to protect and preserve records. And we want to be able to help the agencies. So I hope you look forward to more information from us. And if you have any questions about the service, please give me a call too. But I want to thank our speakers. I appreciate your time and your effort in giving us background on electronic records, the horror stories of not preserving, and also the ways that we can keep it. So, and thank you to the audience for being here. And we look forward to seeing you next year.
Yes, thanks for all the wonderful questions. It's a lot more fun when people are engaged in asking questions.
Yeah. All right.
And I am going to probably come back at some point and ask everybody if they've run into a Bronto bite yet, because I didn't realize that's what it's called, and it's kind of cool.
Well, there's one beyond that too. What was it? I saw bite or something like that. It's ridiculous. I don't know who comes up with the names.
Not us, unfortunately.
We just call it 42 for life, the universe, and everything.
Yes.
Yeah.
It should be the although there's part of me that thinks it should be the Who bite, because Doctor Who,
yes.
the sort of it as big as you need on the inside, and so one size on the outside.
I think that should be the next recommendation. Yeah. Thanks, guys. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.